In this small world of ours, there are many things that people fear. Some may fear the darkness and the unknown of the deepest seas. Some may fear the unknown of the supposed supernatural. Or some may fear what lies beyond this pale blue rock, and what lurks in the darkest corners of the vastness of space. For me, there is one topic that as my curiosity and interest in it grows, my fear and disgust in it grows even larger. In history, humanity has continually forced atrocities and death upon one another. In the 20th century, there was a conflict that was so insidious, so inhumane, that many hoped and preached it would spell the end of war forever. You may think I am speaking of the well-known and understood Second World War. And although the atrocities and loss of the Second World War cannot be understated, its predecessor was in many ways more vile, sickening, and tragic. In my journey to study the world and its history, the First World War has always stuck with me. From the first use of suffocating poisonous gas, to fighting in trenches filled with the corpses of young souls who never truly experienced the full joys of life, the horrific unnatural visual elements of no man's land, and many other horrific sights. To keep it simple, the First World War terrifies me. It makes the very fiber of my soul sick to its core. Please sit back, relax, and come with me as I delve into the true horrors of the First World War. I hope you enjoy. To understand the First World War, we must first give a little history lesson into why the conflict arose. In the 20th century, Europe had been enjoying a relatively quiet period in retrospect of its previous history of continuous wars. However, after decades of alliances forming, treaties being signed, and continued strain between the empires of Europe, all it would take was a small spark to burn Europe down. In this dawn of the new century, and amidst the industrialization brought on from the Industrial Revolutions, the empires of Europe had developed various new armaments. Although many of the European leaders at the time truly hoped they would not have to use them, but many of them knew that there was a storm brewing, and many knew that war may be inevitable. The power structure of Europe was slowly shifting toward change. The empires of old were on their last legs. Many of them were looking for new territorial gain, and to reclaim lands lost in previous conflicts. Austria-Hungary was once a thriving empire. But after centuries of conflict, political strain, and a heavily ethnic diverse populace, the empire was still looking for ways to expand its borders and sphere of influence to try and stay alive. The small nation of Serbia had hopes of unifying the Slavic peoples. This was viewed as a threat to the power of Austria-Hungary, for if the Slavic people of the Austro-Hungarian Empire were to seek independence, it would surely spark a huge independence movement that would tear the empire apart. The Empire of Russia was also in a steady state of decline. For centuries, most of the population of Russia lived in extremely poor conditions, and most lived in a life of serfdom, and lacked really any human rights. The Emperor of Russia was exceedingly unpopular, and struggled to assert control over his empire. Russia had assured Serbia that if there were to ever be a war with Austria, Russia would come to Serbia's aid. Then there was the German Empire, a relatively young country in the European system. They had really only existed as a unified nation for a few decades. They closely aligned themselves with Austria-Hungary, although they feared the outcome of Austria-Hungary's endeavors in the Balkan nations. They knew that any major debacle in the region would surely thrust Europe into war. They were correct. For on June 28, 1914, in the region of Bosnia and Herzegovina, in the city of Sarajevo, the next in line for the Austro-Hungarian throne, Archduke Franz Ferdinand, was struck down by an assassin named Gavrilo Princip. This was the moment that would be the catalyst that would spark the uneasy tensions of Europe. As stated, the empires of Europe had shining new arsenals of death and destruction. Machine guns that could expend hundreds of rounds per second, massive new artillery shells, artillery guns that could launch shells hundreds of miles. These arsenals would only expand due to the need for new weapons to push the advantage in this war to end all wars. Shells full of toxic gases that could melt the internals of those who breathed them in. Flamethrowers that could burn the literal flesh off of dozens of soldiers at once. Tanks that could push the offensive and destroy enemy fortifications. The list goes on. However, what had not evolved in this new state of war was the minds and strategies of the generals and tacticians who led the armies of Europe. The cult of the offensive reigned supreme. This concept refers to the idea most generals at the time had that it was better to attack than to defend. The tactics of large charges of men to overwhelm their enemies were still the norm. This idea of the nobility of war, the brave will to charge into your enemy, with bayonets fixed and the fire in the soldier's eyes for glory and heroism, were still the norm. In ways, the First World War often reminds me of if the conflicts of the Middle Ages met modern-day warfare. Soldiers wearing makeshift armor at times and wearing the standardized metal helmets, using horses to traverse to the front lines in this muddy and wet French countryside is a strange historical parallel from two very different periods in history. What these generals did not understand was that war had changed. Imagine yourself as a young British or German soldier. You've been told for months that now that you're of age, you should enlist for the glory of serving one's country. The war will be over by Christmas, they say, and you will be a hero, like your father and his father before him, only to be met by the shocking new reality of war. You are in a trench, filled with hundreds of dead men no older than yourself, being eaten by bacteria and rats. Disease is rampant. If the Germans or the English don't kill you, this new Spanish flu will, or maybe you can catch consumption, or as you and I know it, tuberculosis. You are suddenly alerted by your superiors to prepare yourself. You stand up, grab your weapon, ready your bayonet, and prepare for your first encounter that will submit yourself in the books of history. The commanding officer blows the whistle, and you begin your ascent behind your comrades, up the ladder to no man's land. The soldier in front of you takes a stray bullet and is immediately killed, but there's nothing you can do. You persist. You look ahead and all you see is a landscape unlike anything you've ever seen. No trees, no grass, no wildlife. Only mud, blood, bodies, craters, barbed wire, men dropping by the hundreds from machine gun fire, and this sight stretches for miles and miles, as if the world you knew before was just a sweet, distant dream. You can barely even make out your enemy. They are just little flashes of gunfire in the distance, barely visible above the surface of the earth. These thousands of men were thrown to the meat grinder, charging like their fathers and their forefathers in the wars against Napoleon. But for you are met with machine gun rounds and shells slamming into the earth as if God were raining hellfire. On average, a soldier in World War I was expected to live a mere 6 weeks in service. If you survived past this estimate, it's hard to say you were lucky. You would continually have to live through this nightmare day in and day out, forced to do your general's bidding, charging like a madman in the face of death, and for what? To claim a rat-infested mud hole of a trench? No wonder so many boys came home from this war and were never the same as when they left. General Erich von Falkenhayn said about his time in the Battle of Verdun that his strategic plan was to bleed France white. Although he never said this during his time in the war, only mentioning it years later, it's a sad reality to see that the hollow generals who led millions to their death simply viewed these meat grinder tactics as a simple strategic price for a lousy victory. These dated tactics of pushing the offensive, thrusting yourself at your enemy, and forcing a retreat were merely a death sentence. The use of trench warfare was not a new concept. It had been used in many wars in previous decades. But with this new age of mechanized warfare, it became a bloody slog for a mere feet of territory. There was no grand offensive to push the Germans back to Germany. Instead, the lines from 1914 to 1918 would change very little, shifting by mere miles only to be undone by a responding enemy attack. For 4 years, the sons of Europe were bound by this slog that can only be described as the definition of insanity, performing the same tasks and expecting a different outcome each time. If I was told to pick one factor of the First World War that out of all the others frightened me the most, I would point toward chemical warfare. The use of poisonous gas was a new concept in this modern era of war. If you look to the world today, it is well known that chemical weapons are illegal in warfare. This is for great reason, because gas is terribly cruel. In the Great War, chemical gas was simply viewed as a tool to help one side or the other end this brutal war. However, all chemical gas did was produce even further suffering. The effects of popular gases such as mustard gas, chlorine gas, and phosgene gas truly horrific. The symptoms of gas vary on the severity of exposure and the form of gas that a soldier came into contact with. From temporary or even permanent blindness, lung scarring, trouble breathing, horrible skin irritation, blistering, even the flesh appearing to fall right from the body, and even in some cases, the respiratory system virtually melting inside the human body. The first large-scale use of poison gas was done by the German army in April 22nd of 1915. After this, gas became a common weapon to help disorient and cause havoc amongst enemy combatants. However, in some instances these attacks would literally come back to bite the side that utilized gas. In 1915, a few months after the Germans first used chlorine gas, the British Army, in outrage, used chlorine gas at the Battle of Loos. During the attack, the gas was blown back into the British trenches due to a sudden change in wind. Imagine, you're ready to finally take some new ground after living in the same hole for months, only for you to be horribly afflicted by your country's own weapon. I will end this section with a truly horrific tale from the Great War. In August of 1915, the German army deployed chlorine gas against Russian soldiers at the Soviets' fortress on the Eastern Front in what is today Poland. The Russians afflicted had their skin melting from their body, and their lungs began to turn to liquid due to the hydrochloric acid from the chlorine gas mixing with the moisture in the lungs. These Russian soldiers continued their attack, coughing up blood and bits of their own lungs. The attacking German force was so frightened that they began to retreat. The Russians continued to defend their territory, even though their fate was already sealed in death. They continued to fight, causing the Germans to flee in horror, only to be ensnared in their own barbed wire defenses. The Russians managed to defend their territory before they succumbed to their fate. Unfortunately, only for the Russian army to abandon the fortress not long afterward. The story has long been known and fabled as the attack of the dead men. If the world learned one truly important lesson from the First World War, it's that gas is a cruel weapon that should never, ever be deployed on battlefields ever again. In the Battle of Verdun, that began on February 21st, 1916, and raged for 303 days, over 60 million artillery shells were dropped. On average, over 2.1 artillery shells were dropped every second of every day for nearly a year. Take a second to wrap your mind around those numbers. 2.1 artillery shells per second. The closest thing you and I can imagine to this is if a major 4th of July fireworks display were occurring every minute for a whole year. Can you even begin to imagine the psychological effects of the earth violently shaking, ear-deafening explosions, the earth being thrown dozens of feet into the air, your comrades being struck by shrapnel for every day, non-stop, for almost a year? In the days during and after the war, dozens of soldiers fell victim to the phenomenon known as shell shock. Men with cold gazes, violently shaking, some unable to balance themselves, and stricken with Parkinson-like tremors. Today, this phenomenon is commonly known as post-traumatic stress disorder. But in the early 20th century, the field of psychology and the knowledge of mental health was understood very little. Many of these men were shocked into catatonic states, unable to fight. Hundreds of these men were labeled deserters, and many were sentenced to death for what their command saw as treason. Those who managed to survive the war went home to a society that viewed them as weak, mentally ill, and in some cases, simple dead weight. Many would end up in asylums, spending the rest of their lives living in terrible conditions, and those who managed to return to a somewhat average life were never the same, having bouts of seizure-like symptoms, quick to anger due to thinking they were still fighting for their lives in those fields of France, and other horrible psychologically rooted symptoms. Personally, I struggle to view the footage of these men who were stricken by this horrific ailment. It pains me to see these brave men suffer and be ashamed and prodded at as if they were some sort of science experiments gone wrong. Thankfully, in the time since the war, we as a society have grown, but I feel so sick to the fact that these men were never able to live a normal life again. Even after coming home, the war never truly left them, scarred psychologically till the end of their days. Out of all the cruel bringers of death we've discussed, there's one we have yet to really discuss. In the Great War, out of all the ways one could perish, the one culprit that caused so much pain and suffering was disease. In history, disease has always been a huge cause of death, especially during wartime. The Great War was a breeding ground of terrible illnesses due to poor conditions of living, lack of medical supplies, and food for soldiers and civilians. The American Expeditionary Force recorded that out of its 1 million man fighting force, over 25% fell ill, being either from the H1N1 strain of influenza or from pneumonia, tuberculosis, or other terrible diseases. On average, 13,000 Americans died from influenza, and over 39,000 died from pneumonia. Other diseases that afflicted soldiers of the Great War include typhoid fever, trench fever, and typhus. The British Army recorded over 525,000 cases of this new trench fever. Although the cause of trench fever is not well understood, it is assumed to be from the poor conditions of trench life, from rat and human carcasses being openly exposed, lice, human and rodent fecal matter, and other unsanitary conditions. This disease vanished from the earth after the war concluded, and thus why we have little to no data on what its cause was. Another horrible ailment was gas gangrene. Imagine surviving a gas attack, being thankful to have survived, although being seriously physically injured. As you begin to heal, your body begins to develop the terrible bacterial infection of gangrene due to the open wounded sores on your body and the internal damage inflicted from gas. This has to be one of the most horrific ways to go out. Imagine surviving a horrible gas attack, being left permanently physically injured, only to die a slow and painful death from bacterial infection. One of the even more tragic aspects of this subject is that these are just the numbers and statistics of the Allied forces, and they are believed to be much higher. Several other nations involved suffered horrific losses from disease, and as for the German and Austrian armies, who made up some of the largest fighting forces, we still to this day do not have a record on the amount of soldiers and civilians who perished from disease. These numbers for these nations are likely to be far larger than the Allies, due to the malnourishment and lack of supplies in Germany and Austria due to the Allied blockade of Europe. In this world of ours, there are many things to be afraid of. History is no exception. The horror stories of history terrify me. Not like ghosts, not like sharks. I'm not afraid of words or photos on a page, but what these events portray terrifies me. A possibility that this could all once again unfold as it did then. The age-old expression, those who do not learn from history are doomed to repeat it, holds stronger than ever when facing the topic of the Great War. There have been hundreds of conflicts since the guns fell silent in 1918, each with their own horrors and atrocities. The First World War, to many, will always fall into the shadow of the Second World War due to the larger amount of casualties and the horrors of the Holocaust. However, as human beings, it is important and our duty that we do not leverage conflicts above one another, simply for the amount of lives lost. Every life lost unnecessarily is a tragedy equal to the last. Human life is precious and should be viewed as such. We mustn't allow the horrors of the Great War to unfold again. Those boys who gave their lives in the fields of France, on the fields of the East, in the sands of Africa, on the high seas, wherever and however they fell, should be remembered. Many say the First World War was fought over nothing and was one of the largest wastes of human life of the modern era. Let us not view the sacrifice of those brave boys in vain. Let us remember them and use their sacrifice and their suffering as a powerful lesson we shall not forget. War is cruel. War will always be cruel. Unlike the emperors of Europe in 1914, we must not view war as a necessity for gains or for glory. We must look at war as the product of a lack of communication. We must search for diplomacy, talk out our differences, see the plight of those on the other side, so that blood may never again be spilt in the name of indifference. And now, as time ticks by, these men are forever gone, forever enshrined in the minds of those who knew them and in photographs, lining the walls of the homes of their families and in the textbooks we assign our children. Let these men live on forever, as they wished, as heroes and with glory in the halls of history, lest we forget those who fought and died from 1914 to 1918. Thank you for watching.
The sun's shining down on these green fields of France. The warm wind blows gently and the red poppies dance. The trenches have vanished long under the plow. No gas, no barbed wire, no guns firing now. But here in this graveyard that's still no man's land, the countless white crosses in mute witness stand to man's blind indifference to his fellow man. And a whole generation were butchered and damned. Did they beat the drum slowly? Did they play the pipe lowly? Did they sound the death march as they lowered you down? Did the band play the last post and chorus? Did the pipes play the flowers of a fall?